Dakar, Vichy French-controlled Senegal, 1940. The deep hum of the engines and the sounds of naval gunfire echo in your ears as you watch the battle below. You are part of the crew of a walrus spotter plane, giving firing directions to your home ship, the HMAS Australia. It's a hard job, as the French smokescreens play havoc with your visibility. All the while, the Australia is taking a beating. Multicoloured smoke trails from the shells of the French guns search out the Australia, some smashing into her side. Finally, the smoke screen clears below, and you can see the French cruisers. The Australia's shells are falling into the water nearby. You pass on the targeting information. The next barrage will score some direct hits. But then, machine gun bullets rake the side of your plane as a French fighter shoots past. Desperately, the pilot tries evasive maneuvers, but your plane is clunky and slow compared to the sleek French aircraft. Locking on, it fires at you, guns blazing. Bullets slam into your plane and a fire starts. As the smell of burning oil fills your nose, the walrus goes into its death spin towards the sea. The last words you'll ever hear are, "We're going down!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Hope you enjoyed the holidays. For our first episode of 2026, we're covering one of the least known operations of World War II. Operation Menace was a joint British and Free French attempt to seize the West African port of Dakar from the Vichy French collaborationist regime. It was meant to be a walk in the park, with the local French soldiers and sailors anxious to join de Gaulle. Instead, it turned into a humiliating defeat, the very epitome of how not to launch an amphibious invasion. The origins of the debacle at Dakar start with France's darkest moment of the 20th century. Hitler's panzers had crushed the mighty French army, first by exploding through the Ardennes, destroying 3 armoured divisions and forcing the British to evacuate from Dunkirk. Shorn of much of their industrial region and armour, the French had mounted a determined but doomed defence of their heartland, which ended days after the Nazis arrogantly strutted into Paris, the swastika flying above the City of Light. Defeatist and pro-fascist French leaders like the shifty, toad-like Pierre Laval, the aged and senile former war hero Marshall Petain, and Premier Paul Renaud's scheming mistress Hélène de Portis, forced Renaud out, pushed Petain in, and he immediately called for an armistice. On June the 22nd, 1940, in the same railway car that Marshal Ferdinand Foch had used back in 1918 to extract the armistice from Germany that had ended World War I, on the same site, a silent but smirking Hitler watched as a humiliated France accepted his terms. While northern France would be occupied, a rump state in the south would be allowed a measure of independence and to remain neutral in the war. It would even be allowed to still rule over the vast French colonial empire and its large navy. Based out of the southern spa town of Vichy, this rump state would become the infamous Vichy French collaborationist regime under Marshall Petain. There was one French general who still wanted to fight Germany, Charles de Gaulle, a hero of France and a legend in his own right today. In 1940, he was just a relatively obscure general. A British official described him at the time as, quote, a strange-looking man, enormously tall. Sitting at the table, he dominated everyone else by his height, as he had done when walking into the room. No chin, a long, drooping, elephantine nose over a closely cut moustache, a shadow over a small mouth whose thick lips tended to protrude as if in a pout before speaking, a high, receding forehead and pointed head, surmounted by sparse black hair, lying flat and neatly parted. His heavily hooded eyes were very shrewd. When about to speak, he oscillated his head slightly, like a pendulum, while searching for words. End quote. He was an exceptionally difficult man to deal with, proud to the point of arrogance, aloof, direct, autocratic, austere, irascible, stubborn, self-righteous, vain, hypersensitive in some ways, thick-skinned in others, and trusting no one completely. Not for nothing did British Prime Minister Winston Churchill complain that, quote, the heaviest cross I have to bear is the cross of Lorraine. End quote. The cross of Lorraine was both the symbol of de Gaulle and the Free French. Yet de Gaulle also had great strengths. He was a man of vast culture, with a powerful brain and enormous capacity for work and to lead men, combined with a deep love for his country. The most competent of France's generals in the 1930s, and the only one who had embraced modern armoured warfare, he had fled to London when Petain threw in the towel. Once there, he gave a now legendary speech over the BBC to the newly occupied France. Quote, nothing is lost because this war is a world war. In the free world, immense forces had not been brought into play. Some day, these forces will defeat our enemies. On that day, France must be present at the victory. She will then regain her liberty and her greatness. That is my goal, my only goal. This is why I ask all Frenchmen, wherever they may be, to unite with me in action, in sacrifice, and in hope. Our country is in danger of death. Let us fight to save it. End quote. Ironically, barely anyone in France heard this speech, and probably wouldn't have known about it, if not for the overreaction of Petain and his collaborators. The Vichy government put de Gaulle on trial in absentia, charging him with high treason, and August 2nd condemned him to death. This was a blunder by Vichy. By publicising his call to arms, it was now filtering through France and its empire. 4 Vichy newspapers reprinted it in full. French proconsuls across the empire read it, and de Gaulle himself tramped across England, speaking to interned French troops and warship crews, seeking recruits. And he got some. By August, de Gaulle had 7,000 men in his new army, split between England and Egypt. There were now 2 Frances, that of Petain and that of de Gaulle, competing for the soul of the nation and the allegiance of her people. For a Britain that now stood alone against the full might of Hitler's Germany, this situation offered up some interesting opportunities. By August 1940, however, relations between the average Frenchman and Britain had broken down because of an astonishing act by Prime Minister Churchill and the Royal Navy, which led to British ships firing on and sinking Vichy warships. Hanging in the balance of the German-French armistice was the modern and powerful French Navy, which included 2 battle cruisers, 7 battleships, and a large number of cruisers, destroyers, submarines and support ships. In German hands, they could tip the scale of naval power in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The British had to prevent the Germans from taking over these fast warships. 2 battleships, Lorraine and Courbet, were in British ports and were at least out of the game, but the new battlecruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and the older battleships Provence and Bretagne, were at Mers el-Kebir, near Oran in Algeria, and the even newer battleship Richelieu, packing 8 15-inch guns, was at Dakar on the Senegal coast. The British could not let Germany seize them. On July 3rd, 1940, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Squadron appeared off Oran and issued an ultimatum to the French fleet, giving 3 choices: disarm on sight, join up with Britain, or face destruction at the hands of British guns. Admiral Gensoul, commanding the French ships, refused the options, so the British opened fire. Dunkirk and Strasbourg were seriously damaged, Provence beached, and Bretagne sunk. The Vichy French were furious and fumed bitterly over the insulting and apparently treacherous behaviour of their former ally. But British morale and American politicians were impressed. If nothing else, the British would fight on for survival. 4 days later, the British struck again at the Vichy fleet, this time at Dakar, where the brand new battleship Richelieu was at anchor to avoid seizure by either side. At dawn, the British sent in 6 antique fairy swordfish biplanes from the old carrier HMS Hermes, and despite the seeming mismatch of biplanes and battleship guns, the old aircraft did their job, punching a massive hole in the battleship's stem. Dakar's limited dockyard facilities could not repair Richelieu, so she was immobilized, but still able to fire her main battery. The French broke off diplomatic relations with Britain on July the 5th to retaliate for the attacks. They could do little more, and Britain's diplomats in Dakar reported to London on their return that the French colonists and military there were ripe to split from Vichy. The information was actually wrong. The French troops in Dakar were merely angry over German demobilization orders, which cut their numbers and paychecks. But the reports fueled ideas in Britain's War Office, and more importantly, with de Gaulle. Having assembled the beginnings of an army, de Gaulle wanted a base on French-controlled territory. So far, France's proconsuls in the Empire were sticking with Vichy, but if he could establish himself on French colonial soil, he might set off a string of dominoes and gain not just the support of France's far-flung holdings, but also their manpower and resources. Sitting at the centre of French Africa, Dakar could be that place. It was also something of a treasure trove at this time. The French, Belgians and Poles had shifted their gold reserves there before the Nazi conquests, 65 billion francs in all, which could be very useful to the Allies. Encouraging news soon came from France's African colonies, with de Gaulle finally getting some real backing. Félix Éboué, the black governor of Chad, overthrew the Vichy military, put the soon-to-be legendary Colonel Jacques Leclerc in command, and rallied to de Gaulle. Éboué's gutsy move set off a chain reaction in French Equatorial Africa, and the Cameroons and the French Pacific territories joined up with Free France. De Gaulle now had a base of support. The Free French had succeeded in swaying the loyalties of Equatorial Africa. Surely they could do the same in Dakar, went the thinking. Britain also had an interest in seeing Dakar neutralized. The Battle of the Atlantic had just begun, while at the same time the Mediterranean route to India, the oil fields of the Middle East, and the Far East colonies would shortly be closed, forcing British shipping to go round the Cape of Good Hope instead. Dakar was the best port in West Africa. If Germany was allowed to station submarines there, it would be lethal to Britain's war effort. Thanks to these fears, Operation Menace was green-lighted by Churchill. Unknown to London at the time, they had already been saved from this dangerous scenario by an unlikely figure. Hitler had little feel or even interest in naval matters. He was very much focused on a continental land-based strategy. The German Navy begged for a submarine base at Dakar, but the Führer never pursued it with any vigour, his eyes focused on Lebensraum in the east. Decisions based on fantasy and wishful thinking inevitably result in failure. If ever there was a naval and military operation based on these precepts, it was the attack on Dakar. From the start, there was a ludicrously optimistic belief that the soldiers and sailors stationed there were just anxiously waiting to join the Free French. As Churchill boasted to de Gaulle about the Vichy commander at Dakar, quote, "Perhaps he will wish, for honour's sake, to fire a few shots, but he will not go farther, and that evening he will dine with you and drink to the final victory." End quote. As we shall see, nothing could have been further from the truth. A second great flaw was that Menace became something of a passion project for Churchill. He forced it through the wartime bureaucracy in only a week, ignoring all dissent. This gave a distinctly half-assed vibe to the whole affair. Churchill was a great and imaginative war leader, but worked best with careful guidance from the professionals. Without constraints, Churchill's passion projects could easily lead to a disaster like Gallipoli, another operation based on wishful thinking. One member of the joint planners recalled, quote, "The JP were very opposed to Menace from the beginning, but Churchill put very severe, and I think improper, pressure on us, even to the extent of coming in to us in committee and bullying us. Actually, tempers got rather frayed. We made him angry by saying we thought it was an operation which could only succeed with the hearty cooperation of the enemy, which we did not think was a sound basis for planning." End quote. The original Free French plan was to land at the less well-defended city of Conakry, then slowly work their way along the coast towards Dakar, building up momentum as they went. But the British didn't have the resources or the stomach for a prolonged campaign. They demanded a direct assault on Dakar instead. This is where the plan truly began to morph into an overly complex mess. Working on the fantasy that the Vichy French defenders would switch sides, the expedition wasn't actually expected to storm the beaches. The joint Anglo-Free French fleet would suddenly appear before Dakar at dawn, overawing the defenders. Then, de Gaulle's emissaries would sail ashore and win over the governor and top officers. Mission accomplished. However, in practice, this would work as well as when George W. Bush used the phrase in Iraq. De Gaulle had grossly overestimated the extent of his backing. His agents in West Africa assured him that 70% of the Dakar garrison supported his cause, that 20% were neutral, and that a mere 10% favoured Vichy. Much closer to the true position was the estimate of an officer of the French submarine Ajax at Dakar, who classified the French population there on the eve of the Allied attack as 20% favourable to de Gaulle, mainly merchants, 50% indifferent, desiring above all to be left at peace, 30%, mostly the naval and military elements, who backed Petain and Vichy. The naval officers in particular despised de Gaulle and the British after Mers el-Kébir. Overall, the intelligence gathering for Menace was absolutely abysmal. They managed to drastically underestimate the Vichy force on every level. For example, they assumed they were facing only 1,400 barely trained infantrymen. Actually, there were 7,000 battle-hardened troops in Dakar. Operational security was also appallingly lax, which is even more shocking as Menace was highly dependent on being a complete surprise. General de Gaulle, when purchasing a considerable quantity of tropical equipment at Simpson's in Piccadilly, remarked in public that his destination was West Africa. Even worse, drunken Free French officers made not one, Not 2, but 10 stirring toasts of "To Dakar" in the middle of a packed, prestigious London restaurant. Similar incidents occurred in Liverpool pubs as well. Then came an infamous incident at Euston Station in London. De Gaulle, his staff and some British officers were meant to leave quietly for Liverpool. Instead, it turned into a full-on circus. As you stare at the huge crowd gathered at Euston Station, your mouth drops open. This was meant to be a top-secret journey with no fuss for de Gaulle, his staff, and the British officers. Instead, it seems half of London is here. "Good luck in Dakar, mon amour," says a Frenchwoman as she kisses her soldier boyfriend. Then 3 French officers troop by, yelling, "To Dakar!" You physically flinch. What's the matter with these people? The whole station is staring at the commotion. The last straw is when a little girl turns to her mother and says, "Mummy, what's a Dakar?" "I think it's a port in West Africa, dear," she replies. "That's it." You gesture to your aide to get this carnival onto the train quickly. You're about to breathe a sigh of relief when de Gaulle and the officers are finally on board, when you notice a big fat porter huffing and puffing as he comes running up, trundling a large case on a barrow. In his haste, he collides with another porter, and the case smashes to the floor. It falls open, and the wind catches the leaflets inside, lifting them up into the air. Decorated with a tricolour, they prominently say, "For the citizens of Dakar," in big letters. As the leaflets dance in the wind and the porter jumps up and down trying to catch them, you put your head in your hands. So much for operational security. Hitler will be reading about this with his breakfast. All this really happened. It was like a scene in a Carry On movie. Thanks to all the leaks, Vichy soon knew that the Free French and the British were up to something in West Africa. They just weren't entirely sure of the location and the timing. Next up, there was a severe lack of planning about transporting all the necessary equipment and supplies to West Africa. Loading a ship is harder than you may think, especially with a military operation. The first issue was nobody decided which cargo needed to be prioritised, leading to a baffling situation where the ships were packed to capacity, yet the vital motor transports and 4 tons of ammunition were left behind as there was no room. Also, no one had put any thought into planning how the equipment that did get on board should be stored, and nobody told the Liverpool port authorities which supplies had the highest priority for unloading. This seems like a minor problem, but it meant nobody knew where supplies were loaded on each ship. Also, the important cargo they needed to unload first was often buried at the back of cargo bays, whereas useless items had been stored at the front. Bemused quartermasters looking for ammunition found crates filled with spare uniforms and condoms instead. Not that condoms aren't important, of course, but they're not the first thing you need when capturing a port. Admiral John Cunningham was chosen to head the naval force, which consisted of the tough aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the old battleship Resolution, the slightly faster battleship Barham, the cruisers Devonshire and Fiji, 16 destroyers and 2 sloops. 4,000 Royal Marines were packed into 4 transport ships, and Major General Noel Irwin was appointed commander of the land force. The Free French provided 3 sloops, a patrol vessel and 2 Luciole touring aircraft for Ark Royal, along with 2,700 troops. Yet, before this force could leave port, it was delayed due to drama from the Free French. One of the ship's crews hadn't been paid for 3 months and refused to set sail until they got their cash. As the British scrambled to find the money, de Gaulle then threw a tantrum because he had not been provided with a suitable motorboat for use at Dakar. After finally pacifying the angry crew in Gaulle, no easy task, surely now the convoy could get moving? Nope, more drama was on the way. The French crews then refused to sail unless champagne and pâté de foie gras were included in their rations. That has to be the most French request in history. The grumbling British caved in and they got their champagne and foie gras, but still the ships refused to sail. It seems that the captain of one of the ships had lost his mistress, without whom he would not sail. MI5 eventually had to be called in to find her. All in all, the Free French caused a 10-day delay. Finally, the Dakar expedition weighed anchor on August the 31st. Almost immediately, the bad luck that plagued the whole affair struck. On the very first day they were at sea, the German submarine, U-boat 32, put a torpedo into the side of the HMS Fiji, just west of the Hebrides, making her a dockyard case. The British, now short a cruiser, sent Fiji back to the Clyde and replaced her with the HMAS Australia, attached to the home fleet in Scapa Flow. This would come back to haunt Churchill, as he didn't tell the Australians their ship had been sent elsewhere. The problems continued to pile up at sea. Urban was having a terrible time. In the flagship, he was practically cut off from his own troops. The ships could communicate only with signal lamps because of a shortage of trained expert wireless operators. His office was a tiny, sweltering cabin that was so hot that his staff often worked in their underclothes. They only had one typewriter upon which to make the required 200 copies of the 140-page command directions. This made me so glad we had printers and photocopiers now. That must have been a nightmare. Nor were the invaders well prepared. They soon realized just how slapdash this mission was. They only had 15 landing craft, and these were not the sturdy craft that you saw in Saving Private Ryan. These were their rickety predecessors, more likely to sink than get you to the landing beaches. The French troops were completely untrained in amphibious warfare and had never even practiced with the landing craft before, yet they were meant to be the first ashore if the fighting broke out. Their air cover consisted of Ark Royal's 25 Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers and 20 Blackburn Skua fighters, neither of which were the equal of the American-made Hawk 75 fighters and A-22 bombers that the French fielded. As this voyage of the damned continued its slow journey to West Africa, events were occurring around Gibraltar that would play a major role in the failure of Operation Menace. Vichy France were determined to crush the revolt that had broken out in Equatorial Africa, worrying that it might spread. A fleet consisting of 3 light cruisers, the Georges Leguz, Montcalm, and Gloire, sailed from Toulon to put down the insurrection, heading to Libreville in Gabon that was still in the hands of pro-Vichy forces. Since Mers el-Kebir, to reduce tension, the British had chosen a policy of not interfering with Vichy ships on purely French missions. So when the 3 cruisers headed for Gibraltar, there were no plans in hand to stop them. Worse, the British commander at Gibraltar, Admiral Sir Dudley North, had no knowledge of the scheme to invade Dakar. When the 3 cruisers sailed past Gibraltar in the early hours of September the 11th, he took no action to stop them. It wasn't until 4:30 p.m. that the alarm was raised in London, and Vice Admiral Sir James F. Somerville, who commanded Force H based at Gibraltar, reacted. The battle cruiser HMS Renown went to sea to try and prevent the French ships from at least reaching Dakar. Too late. That evening, the French ships were refueling in Casablanca. They left before daylight, heading south. The whole operation was now in doubt. Such powerful reinforcements would make it unlikely that Dakar could be taken without major bloodshed. As Allied ships frantically tried to find the Vichy fleet and get it to turn around, the HMAS Australia came across a darkened ship, which turned out to be Gaulle, moving slowly due to an engine breakdown. What followed was a game of signal lab diplomacy because they couldn't use wireless communication. These high-stakes talks took hours, until eventually the Gaulle sailed back to Casablanca. However, the British weren't so lucky with the other two ships. Well, they did give up on their mission. Instead of heading back to Casablanca, guess where they went? That's right, Dakar. Effectively, the British had chased two formidable ships to exactly where they could do the most damage to Operation Menace. Still, the task force set out from Freetown and headed towards Dakar. Conditions on the ships continued to be terrible, especially on the Barham, ironically, the new flagship of the operation. A British officer lamented that, quote, "The water served in the wardroom with lime juice or whiskey was not just warm, but hot, about the temperature of a hot cup of tea. It seemed that the hot water system went wrong and that the water invaded the cold water circuits. There appeared to be no arrangement for the supply of cool or iced drinks. The troops were no worse off than the officers. It seemed that the only meals during the 3 days of the Battle of Dakar consisted of a sandwich made of bully beef, which was so hot that it melted, and on the last day, so old that it stank." End quote. Sounds wonderful. As they approached their target, the old delusions about Free French support at Dakar continued to influence their thinking. There were 3 predicted scenarios, amusingly codenamed like an adult version of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs: Happy, Sticky, and Nasty. Happy meant that Dakar went over to de Gaulle without a fight, and this was regarded as the most likely scenario. Sticky meant token resistance, while Nasty was a full-on battle. Nasty was regularly downgraded as the least likely scenario, so much so that preparations for it were ludicrous. If fierce resistance occurred, naval gunfire would be directed at vast stacks of groundnuts piled on the harbour wall at Dakar, which would be set on fire and thus persuade the defending forces to capitulate. The smell of burning groundnuts, a Frenchman's kryptonite apparently, works every time. A British lieutenant later wrote that, quote, "The assembled officers found it difficult to believe that this was intended to be taken seriously, but apparently it was." End quote. At about 5 a.m. on the 23rd of September, the expedition arrived off Dakar in the dark, only for more bad luck to strike. The plan was for the fleet to appear as if out of nowhere, in clear view of the shoreline, but out of range of the French guns. This was meant to overawe the defenders into switching sides, but as the fleet assembled, they noticed a problem. Up ahead, shrouding the coast, was, quote, "the dark, dripping, warm wetness of tropical fog," end quote, which was not dispelled by the sun as it rose. They had been told there was no possibility of fog by the Royal Navy meteorologists. Actually, it was a common occurrence at this time of year. Another screw-up. The fleet was there in all its majestic glory, but no one on the shore could see it. Meanwhile, on Dakar itself, a secret team sent in by de Gaulle were learning just how mistaken they had been about Free French popularity in the port. Far from leaning towards de Gaulle, Governor Boisson was loyal to Vichy and hated the British with a burning passion. They tried to win over his officers, but received a cold shoulder from them all, with one enraged officer chasing them down the street, throwing things at them. French forces at Dakar were not going to change sides or meekly surrender, they realized. They were going to fight. Sadly, they had no way of getting this vital intelligence to de Gaulle or to the fleet. At 5:54, 2 unarmed Free French planes made a surprise landing at Wacom Airfield, a fighter base on the Cape Verde Peninsula, a few miles from the town, and put down 4 Free French airmen. Their mission was to persuade the Vichy pilots to throw in their lot with de Gaulle, so the Allied Armada didn't need to fear air attack. This was extremely important to the attackers, since they only had 50 planes, and these were slower than the French aircraft. The commander of the airfield, de la Horie, advanced in all innocence to greet the Free Frenchmen, but when he showed no interest in rallying to de Gaulle, they promptly arrested him, tied him up, and laid out the prearranged success signs by means of ground strips. This signified that the airfield was now able to receive aircraft from the Ark Royal. So far, so good it seemed. Yet it says it all that this was actually the high point of Operation Menace. Disaster now struck. Some of de la Horie's men rushed up, freed him, and took the intruders prisoner instead. Even worse, one of them had a list of Free French sympathizers in Dakar, who the Vichy authorities promptly rounded up. A mere 14 supporters out of a population of well over 100,000. Doesn't that say it all? The Allied commanders didn't know about this reverse until many hours later. At about the same time, 6 swordfish left the Ark Royal and flew over the harbour and the town in the fog, scattering tree-coloured leaflets signed by de Gaulle, calling for them to join the Free French. By all accounts, barely anyone read them, while the swordfish soon faced anti-aircraft fire and French planes. Meanwhile, a speech from de Gaulle went out over the radio to try and win the hearts and minds of the people of Dakar. Next up, 2 Free French motorboats entered the harbour. In the first boat was Commander d'Angelou, head of a delegation of 13 officers and some ratings. In the second boat, there was an armed security detachment of 12 men, just in case things went wrong. What was meant to happen is that the Free French airmen who had supposedly seized control of Wackham Airfield were meant to arrange for cars to meet the landing parties at the quay. De Gaulle's representatives would then proceed to the Governor-General's residence, accompanied, it was hoped, by enthusiastic crowds. Rockets would then announce the success of the mission. As you can probably guess, it did not go according to plan. Instead, the landing party was threatened by a revolver-wielding naval lieutenant and had a distinctly chilly welcome from the senior officer on site, Lieutenant Commander Lefebvre. As the Vichy French awaited orders from the governor, things began to go to hell. The silence is heavy. The tension in the air could be cut by a knife. The glares and cold looks from the guards makes you wonder if it was even worth coming to Dakar. They don't seem friendly to the cause of Free France. The silence is broken by d'Angelou, who casually remarks that, "You have a nice little fleet here." Lefebvre's lips curl in contempt, and he spits out, "Yes, and it is ready to defend itself. You belong to a religious order, and I myself am a believer. We know how to examine our conscience. I have examined mine, and I am absolutely convinced that I have done my duty. France's future lies with Germany." A grim d'Angelou stares at him with sorrow. "Our duty was first of all to fulfill our obligations to England." Lefebvre roars back, "I obey my legitimate orders. Don't talk to me about duty." Suddenly, armed men begin charging towards you, yelling to drop your weapons and put your hands up. The sergeant of the guard strides towards d'Angelou, snarling, "Come with me, traitor." But without missing a beat, d'Angelou lands an almighty kick in his crotch. As he falls to the floor, clutching his manhood and whimpering, you punch Lefebvre in his traitorous face. The guards seemed surprised at the loss of their commanders. Taking advantage of their indecision, you race back to the boats. Fleeing back to the fleet, machine gun fire rakes the water. And a shell lands just to your right, swamping you with water. Until finally you're out of range. Turning around, you see D'Angelo, lying down in the boat, clutching his chest, blood flowing out from between his fingers. D'Angelo would be hospitalized for 6 weeks, but would recover to fight on. The morning's failures threw the expedition into gloom. With the failure of diplomacy, de Gaulle made yet another broadcast, warning that the Royal Navy would train its guns on Dakar if the defenders did not surrender. The Vichy response was gunfire from the coastal batteries, now manned by naval gunners instead of colonial soldiers of questionable reliability. Ironically, these new gunners came from the 2 ships the British had effectively chased into Dakar previously. Tugs manoeuvred the Richelieu to an angle where it could more effectively fire its 2 forward-mounted 15-inch turrets. Clearly, neither Vichy's rulers at Dakar nor their rank and file had any love for de Gaulle or the British. At the same time, 2 of the 4 Vichy submarines at Dakar, Percy and Ajax, put to sea to wreak havoc among the attackers. The British destroyers Foresight and Inglefield spotted them and gave pursuit. Both ships came under shore battery fire and took hits. The Percy showed foolhardy courage, trying to make a surface torpedo attack on the huge Barham. British gunfire sent the submarine to the bottom. At a range of less than 6,000 yards, the Barham opened fire on the French forts with her 15-inch guns. But some of the overshots hit the town, killing civilians, which added to the bad Vichy temper. The Vichyites fired back, hitting Foresight and putting a 9.4-inch shell into Cumberland's hull, seriously damaging the cruiser. At 11:15, Cunningham pulled his ships out of range. Still, de Gaulle did not believe the Vichy men intended to do anything but put up a brief fight to protect honour, then surrender. But clearly there was no way to storm the harbour without a greater battle which could inflame passions in Dakar, or worse, Vichy, and bring the otherwise semi-neutral nation back into the war as a German ally. The British were ready to assault the port, but knew the casualties on both sides would be terrific. Scenario Happy had been a complete and utter failure. Now they were moving on to Scenario Sticky. While Cunningham and de Gaulle plotted their next move, all hands ate lunch, those awful bully beef sandwiches I mentioned earlier. Grumbling sailors and soldiers pronounced them, quote, rotten and unfit for dogs to eat, end quote. Meanwhile, Governor Boisson sent a message confirming that all landings would be opposed. Quote, you have taken the initiative in causing French blood to flow. Keep this responsibility, for blood is already flowing, end quote. The British and the Gaullists decided to try again, this time landing 3 French Marines at Rufisque, a small port on the far side of the bay, 10 miles east of Dakar. The fog and communication breakdowns led to further chaos before the landings could even begin. The fog was thicker than ever, obscuring everything beyond about 3,000 yards, with de Gaulle's ships literally disappearing from view. Unable to use signal lamps, they had to rely on wireless communications, but these were soon overwhelmed by the sheer amount of traffic. As the radio congestion got worse, there was soon a 2-hour delay in getting out and receiving messages. Bad luck then struck again. The French destroyer, l'Audacieux, steamed out, battle flags flying, near Gorée Island, seemingly heading towards the defence's landing craft. The British destroyers Fury and Greyhound steamed in to attack her, joined by the HMAS Australia. Engaging her minutes later at point-blank range, about 4,000 yards, she was then smothered by British fire. An 8-inch shell blew away her bridge and instantly converted her into a blazing wreck. The French destroyer was clearly disabled, and the British withdrew while the blazing French ship drifted ashore, more than 80 of her crew dead. While all this was going on, the British and the Free French lost contact with the landing parties. Not till later would they find out just how much of a farce the landing attempt had been. The first attempt was aborted after some mild shelling and machine gun fire from a Vichy position near the lighthouse. Next, they attempted to land on the beach further south, with the Marines being towed in by the Savignon de Brazzers motorboats, and the other 2 sloops covering the operation as close inshore as possible. When they were within about 300 yards from the beach, isolated rifle shots echoed out from Senegalese troops. It certainly wasn't the hail of fire it's often described as in French memoirs. This was enough for the boats to turn around, and the landings to be cancelled. The British were furious, with one officer writing, quote, "The opposition from a company of native troops had been of the lightest, apparently half-hearted, and supported by the most ineffective rifle fire. A few hits had been scored on the 3 French sloops by a field battery, but not enough to have stopped troops with a minimum of training. But the 3 French Marines had neither leadership nor training, nor even the minimum required for brave men to dash for an objective. It was pathetic." End quote. I bet that helped Anglo-French relations. He was actually being a little bit unfair to the French Marines. They hadn't been trained on amphibious landings. They hadn't even practiced with the landing craft before. A lot of the problems I described would have been ironed out if the operation had been rehearsed. Cut off by the fog and only a sketchy idea of what they were doing, it's perhaps not surprising that they showed little resolution. By the end of operations on the first day, things were not going well. Operation Menace could have been called off, but a message from Churchill steeled their resolve. Quote, "Having begun, we must go on to the end. Stop at nothing." End quote. A new message was sent to Governor Boisson and the people of Dakar. This time the British told them that the Allies had to seize Dakar at all costs and demanded an acceptance of their terms by 6 a.m. on the 24th. Then everybody waited for the Vichy answer. It came at 4 a.m. Boisson rejected the British demand. He would defend his city until the bitter end. There was nothing for it but to proceed with the plan for Situation Nasty. Unrestricted naval and air bombardment must overwhelm the forts in the Richelieu. Then British Marines would be landed. The Free French would have no role in this phase of menace unless their help was essential to avoid failure. The fog was less dense than on the previous day. Visibility in the early morning had increased to 9,000 yards and improved steadily during the day, reaching 15,000 to 20,000 yards at times. But it was still poor. By 7:25, when the ships were within 6,000 yards of the forts, nothing could be seen. At dawn on the 24th of September, Cunningham's 2 battleships and 2 cruisers opened fire on Dakar from 8 miles out, joined by Ark Royal's aircraft, which tried to plaster the forts in Richelieu, as well as the 2 force-wide cruisers. The British had no luck. The French cruisers manoeuvred behind their booms and avoided the torpedoes. The British lost 3 Swordfish planes. At 8:30 a.m, the French submarine Ajax tried to attack the British battleships on the surface, only to be thanked by the Fortune. Barham and Resolution traded salvos with the forts and Richelieu for 40 minutes, by which point fog and smoke rendered the French fully covered. As a lull in the fighting began, the heat was becoming a real problem for the miserable British, especially as it was a particularly hot day even for West Africa. A gunnery lieutenant later complained that, quote, "Humidity conditions were quite appalling, and I soon abandoned any idea of the crew wearing anti-flash gear. In fact, we wore overalls and nothing underneath. In the magazines, men were passing out, being dragged out into the handing room, having a bucket of water thrown over them, and then going back in to have another bash. Between bombardment runs, we withdrew to seaward, and gun-house crews were allowed on top of the turrets. Completely disregarding the captain, admiral, and general on the bridge above, we all stripped off our overalls, and in our birthday suits faced the breeze, holding the overalls over our heads to dry out. I should have said that first, on stripping, we would wring out the overalls, getting a good mugful out of each." End quote. That must have been quite a sight for the officers. As the battle resumed, the French Air Force materialised, with Glen Martin bombers trying to make high-level attacks to no avail. After waiting for the smoke to dissipate, the British tried again, shelling the French for half an hour, with the Barnum suffering 4 hits from French fire. The British fired more than 400 rounds of 15-inch ammunition, and yet completely failed to silence the shore batteries, while causing more civilian casualties in the town. The smaller French batteries, which were damaging the British destroyers, could not be silenced. Having achieved next to nothing, the fleet retired in the afternoon. The next morning, the fog finally lifted, and visibility was better. Surely, today would be the day. The battleships steamed in, white ensigns flying, to resume bombarding the port, while 2 cruisers headed for Goree Bay to take on Force Y. At 9 a.m, the Richelieu opened fire on the Barham at a range of 23,000 yards. The 2 dreadnoughts traded salvos like 2 punch-drunk boxers. As the British ships turned to their bombardment course, tragedy struck. While you are proud to be a submariner, there is something inherently unnatural about your profession. A small pressurized tube, sailing underwater in the vast ocean, a realm man was not meant to visit. Shaking off your thoughts, you focus on the British ships up ahead through the periscope. You are the commander of the last submarine at Dakar, the Beviziers. You're determined to avenge the sinking of your 3 sister submarines. Having served with the British before the fall of France, you recognize the blue 7 flag they have raised, meaning to turn to bombarding course. You know exactly where the ships are going to turn. Prepare to fire 4 torpedoes, you yell to your crew. As the bridge comes alive with activity, you wait for the blue 7 flag to be lowered, awaiting the perfect moment to strike. There it is. The flag is being lowered. Fire the torpedoes! A fan of 4 yellow-headed torpedoes speed towards the British battleships. The Barham just manages to avoid them, but the Resolution is too slow. One slams into her port side as a great column of dirty water is thrown up into the sky. A hit, you shout out to the cheering crew. For France and for Petain. The old battleship suffered serious flooding and slowed to a halt. Cunningham ordered 2 destroyers to cover Resolution with a smokescreen. Meanwhile, Barham engaged Richelieu, Devonshire fired at Fort Manuel, and Australia took on Force Y. The French shot back accurately, hitting Bahrain once and Australia twice. The Australia's spotter walrus seaplane had just reported, as we saw in the opening dramatisation, that the Australia was close to hitting one of the French ships, but then it was shot down by a French plane and crashed into the sea, causing the Australia's only casualties of the battle. At 9:20 a.m, all British ships ceased fire and withdrew on a southern course, under cover from the Ark Royal's fighters. Resolution was now doing a bare 10 knots with a 12-degree list, which made her a target for French bombers, but she avoided further damage. On his flag bridge, Cunningham did the sums. All 4 of his heavy ships had been damaged. Further attacks could lead to unacceptable losses on his side, and Vichy French alliance with Hitler on the other. Cunningham decided to withdraw the entire force to Freetown. Operation Menace had failed, and Dakar would remain under Vichy control, at least for now. For all the shells that had been fired, casualties had been relatively light on both sides. The Vichy French lost 166 dead and 340 wounded, while the Free French suffered 3 killed and 5 wounded. 36 British servicemen were killed or wounded in the battle. To the world, Churchill wrote, the affair, quote, seemed a glaring example of miscalculation, confusion, timidity, and muddle. End quote. He was right. The New York Times wrote that, quote, from the first to the last, the Dakar adventure appears to have been a major blunder. It would be folly for the British or their friends to minimise the probable effects of this defeat. End quote. While the American ambassador to the UK reported that, quote, the Dakar situation is a bitter pill for the entire cabinet, and, from my observation, for the entire country. The newspapers have been most critical. It is the first real break in the Churchill popularity, and there's a definite feeling that they have not a Prime Minister, but a Generalissimo. End quote. German and Vichy propaganda had a field day with British ineptitude, and the Australian government complained to Churchill about learning of the use of their heavy cruiser only after the operation was over. It was left to Churchill to smooth over ruffled Australian feelings, and he did so in that classic British tradition by blaming the French. Poor intelligence, slipshod planning, and over-optimism about the will of the Vichy French forces to resist had all played their part in the Dakar debacle. Honestly, the Allies weren't yet in any state to launch successful amphibious operations. Little had changed since Gallipoli in 1915, or the failed landings in Norway in 1940. Most of the paraphernalia of the later Allied invasions had not even been invented yet. Sophisticated amphibious landing craft, coordinated air observation, fire control, even accurate weather forecasting were all marvels yet to come. Yet there were some positives. The British never underestimated Vichy troops again, using heavy forces to overwhelm their defences in Syria and Madagascar later in the war. De Gaulle and the Free French had taken a blow politically, but their gains in Equatorial Africa remained loyal. De Gaulle still had immense energy and refused to let the defeat at Dakar get him down, or stop the cause of Free France. He headed straight to French Equatorial Africa, and there the Free French added Gabon to their territories. Ultimately, Dakar would go over to the Allied side in November 1942, after Operation Torch and the German occupation of Vichy France. With American assistance, even the Richelieu, that ship that Britain had tried to sink so many times, would serve the Allied cause in Europe and the Pacific. Perhaps the biggest lesson of Operation Menace is that with a military operation, never assume that the most optimistic scenario is inevitably going to happen. More often than not, that's going to bite you in the ass. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we head to the deserts of Sudan, where a revolt is stirring against Egyptian rule. Soon, one of the worst armies in history will march into the wilderness to battle the mysterious rebel leader, the Mahdi. What happens next will drag the British Empire into numerous wars and change Sudan's history forever. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.